Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Yes, look, I've just got a couple of quick questions about Defence's implementation of the government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender. So wanting to just know what actions you have taken to implement the guidelines.
I've got a couple of questions. I'll come back to you.
Acting Deputy Secretary, people. To position this, because there has been quite a bit of work done, Senator, if we go back to 2012, at the same time as our Pathway to Change reform, to complement that, we put into place the Whole of Defence Gender and Inclusion Strategy. We actually didn't release that till 2013, even though it is 2012-17. As part of that release in 2013, we made sure that we reflected the guidelines in the overarching strategy. So in that sense, I think we were one of the first, at least large agencies, to do that. From the strategy itself, we identified particular diversity groups, and I think today the language is more contemporary, but as phrased in that strategy, priority groups included women, Indigenous Australians, people with disability, the LGBTI community. And in terms of then positioning where we could then put the guidelines into place, that provided a loose but broad framework. So in terms of the practical things, we did adapt our systems, so our HR system, also our surveys, to ensure that we had that in place. I think it was July 16, that requirement. So that has occurred. The other things, though, that I think in some ways are the more meaningful things are around how do you communicate around different forms of gender identity. So in that respect, we have got quite a bit of information in print. So in my area, that relates to what we make available in our diversity inclusion pages. We also started some work early on guides for managers. Today, one good example of that is we currently have at the Australian Defence Force Academy a guide for managers in terms of how to lead and be inclusive for people that have various gender orientations. In addition to that, my area in the medical, so Joint Health Command, have worked hard from the medical point of view, but in particular really encouraging conversations with commanders as well as the medical establishment in terms of how we best include, as I said, but also work with individuals on a case-by-case basis in an organisation where obviously different gender orientations aren't the norm in a very large organisation. So that's sort of where we are now. I don't think we've finished in terms of implementing the guidelines, but it's certainly been one of a number of priorities that came out of that original work.
It's very good to hear. Can you give me a bit more detail? You talked about working with commanders as to what the training training opportunities, whether training's mandatory sort of across the organisation.
So in terms of the inclusive, I guess, culture that we are trying to really bring around, it comes back to the Pathway to Change comments I think the VCDF provided earlier, that we have really pushed now towards a place where commanders, leaders are being held to account, not only for a positive workplace climate, but an inclusive one. So it comes into all command and leadership training in terms of what are the expectations and what are the behaviours that are central to our cultural reform. So in that way, it's strongly, I guess, a strong theme in all leadership and command training. How do we then support commanders with particular cases, which I think is where you are heading? So we have certainly in material available as guides to managers, leaders in the organisation. We are not yet to finalise a definite policy, and that policy piece is still a work in progress. but we are consulting on that piece with various communities. In fact, as I speak, Senator.
So, yes, I mean, so in terms of the training, whether it's mandatory, I think across the range of departments I've talked about, that there can be policies, but then it's the implementation of them, and whether you've got comprehensive, respectful relationships, essentially, or whether there are some people that whether it's much more ad hoc across the organisation.
Well, the other thing that has been implemented most recently is we totally refreshed our mandatory workplace behaviour training. So that is mandatory across the ADF and APS workforce. That has been refreshed along the lines and themes that I've just spoken about.
That's good to hear. So, and in terms of, so that's your sort of internal, but can you give me a bit more detail about sort of the external facing operations of defence in terms of being gender sensitive and respectful?
Yes. It was probably about 2011 that we engaged Pride and Diversity to really help us in this area and to give us greater capability. I don't think we were very capable at that time. So the Pride organisation has helped build up some skills for us. We've continued to have that organisation. We have a membership with that organisation that we pull on at various times. We have also an internal network, and in addition to that, indeed, most recently, we had a group of those who are part of our LGBTI workforce who actually talked to the previous acting secretary for some time to really share what the challenges were for them. And more recently, they talked to Secretary Moriarty in terms of some of those issues as well. So we are really trying to learn at the same time. I don't think we've stopped learning since 2011. Other external things we do, clearly the most obvious to the nation is the march in the Mardi Gras as an external recognition of us embracing an inclusive workforce.
And finally, in terms of the work that you do with other agencies, or say with the interactions between defence and states and territories, how have you done any work of ensuring that any joint projects or combined things that you do, that the guidelines are being fully implemented and there is respect and recognition?
What I would say there is we benchmark ourselves every year in the Australian Workplace Equality Index. So that is one way. So we are compared to other organisations across Australia that also partake in that index, and that's growing year by year. So that is a benchmark for us. In terms of states, the other thing we do is I really try and look at the data and the research, but that's probably where we are at the moment.
And in terms of all of the various, agencies that fall within the defence portfolio, so all of what you've just been talking about applies throughout all of those?
Senator, I'm not sure what you mean by
agencies.
So you don't mean the Defence Department as a whole. It applies across the Department of Defence.
I'm thinking, so in particular parts, whether they are all across the department is completely compliant.
Yes, Senator.
Okay, good. Thank you.